I want you to imagine the worst day of your life. Now imagine that on that exact day, while you're standing at a graveside saying goodbye to your mother, a stranger with a clipboard decides that your parking spot matters more than your grief. That's not a hypothetical for me. That's exactly what happened. And what I did next changed the way an entire neighborhood thinks about power, decency, and what happens when you push a grieving person just a little too far. My name is Rachel, and this is my story. The woman I was burying. My mother, Diane, was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once. She taught third grade for 31 years. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 11 months before she died, and in that time, I watched a woman who had never asked anyone for help learn how to accept it, slowly, painfully, and with more grace than I ever expected to witness. I moved back into her house during the last 4 months. I gave up my apartment, put my furniture in storage, and became her full-time caregiver alongside 2 rotating hospice nurses. I want to be clear about this because it matters for what comes later. My mother's house was in a planned community called Willow Creek Estates, governed by a homeowners association. I was not on the deed. I was not, technically, a resident in any official sense. I was a daughter taking care of her dying mother, parking my car in the driveway of the house I grew up in. The HOA at Willow Creek had a reputation before I ever set foot back in that neighborhood. My mother used to joke about it during phone calls when I lived 3 states away. They fined the Hendersons for a garden gnome, she'd say. They fined Pete for having his trash can visible for 4 hours on a Tuesday. I laughed along with her because it sounded absurd, almost charming in its pettiness. I did not yet understand that petty people with a little bit of institutional power are not charming. They are dangerous. There was a specific rule at Willow Creek that would come to define the worst week of my life. Overnight street parking was prohibited except in a resident's own driveway, unless a visitor permit was displayed on the dashboard. My mother's driveway fit exactly 2 cars comfortably. My mother had her sedan. I had my car. Do the math and you'll see the problem before I did. I should mention that I did try to do things the right way at the start. When I first moved back in, I looked up the HOA's website and found a downloadable visitor parking permit form. I filled it out, printed it, and set it on the dashboard the way the instructions described. For the first few weeks, that seemed to solve everything. It was only later, once my mother's condition worsened and the rhythm of our days became consumed by medication schedules, nurse visits, and the sheer physical work of caregiving, that small administrative tasks like renewing a monthly permit started slipping through the cracks. I want to be fair here. This wasn't a case of a stranger flagrantly ignoring rules out of arrogance. It was a case of a person trying to hold together a household in crisis, missing a form here and there, and assuming that basic human context would matter if anyone ever asked why. For the first 3 months, it worked fine. Then my mother's disease progressed to the point where she needed a hospital bed set up in the living room, oxygen equipment, and space for nurses and equipment deliveries. The garage, once big enough for 2 vehicles, became storage for medical supplies almost overnight. My car ended up parked on the street in front of the house, 3 feet from our own driveway, most nights. I want to be honest with you. I did not always remember to fill out a visitor parking form. Grief and exhaustion do that to a person. There were nights I was awake for 18, 20 hours straight, managing pain medication schedules, calming my mother down during moments of confusion, holding her hand while she cried about missing my father's funeral 7 years earlier because she'd been too sick to travel that year, and now understanding, in a strange and cruel symmetry, that she wouldn't be at anyone's funeral again either. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a permit form felt like the least important piece of paper in the world. The first warning. About 6 weeks before she passed, I found a bright yellow notice tucked under my windshield wiper. It read, in bold letters, "Violation Notice, Unauthorized Overnight Parking." Below that, in smaller print, was a warning that a second violation would result in towing at the vehicle owner's expense. I remember standing in the driveway holding that piece of paper, laughing in a way that had nothing to do with humor. I went inside, found the HOA's phone number on an old newsletter in a kitchen drawer, and called. The woman who answered introduced herself as Denise, the property manager who handled violations on behalf of the board. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. My mother was terminally ill. I was her full-time caregiver. The garage was full of medical equipment. I asked if there was any kind of hardship exception, temporary permit, or accommodation for a situation like this. Denise's response has stayed with me. She said, "I understand that's difficult, but the rules apply to everyone. You can submit a written request to the board, but until it's approved, the violation stands. I submitted that written request that same night. I attached a letter from my mother's hospice coordinator confirming her diagnosis and care needs. I asked for a temporary, 30-day accommodation. I never received a response. Not an approval. Not a denial. Nothing. Just silence, which I now understand was its own kind of answer. The day. My mother died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with the window open and a mockingbird singing outside, which felt like something she would have found funny if she'd been able to comment on it. The funeral was scheduled for that Saturday, giving my brother time to fly in from overseas and giving me time to fall apart in private before I had to hold myself together in public. That Saturday morning, I dressed in the black dress I'd bought for my father's funeral 7 years earlier because buying a new one felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. I drove my car, the same car, the one that had accumulated 2 more warning notices in the week since my mother's death, notices I'd shoved into a drawer without reading closely because I was drowning in funeral arrangements, insurance calls, and the particular exhaustion of watching someone die slowly and then suddenly all at once. I parked in the driveway that morning, because for once, the garage wasn't fully blocked. My brother had helped me clear some of the medical equipment out earlier that week, arranging for a company to collect the hospital bed and oxygen concentrator. I thought, foolishly, that this meant the parking problem was behind me. What I didn't know was that a delivery truck dropping off flowers for the service that morning had blocked half our driveway for 20 minutes, forcing me to move my car to the street so the truck could unload. 20 minutes. That's how long my car sat on the street before I drove to the church. The funeral itself is mostly a blur to me now, the way trauma tends to compress time into fragments. I remember my brother's hand on my shoulder. I remember the pastor's voice cracking slightly when he mentioned my mother's decades in the classroom. I remember 80, maybe 90 people, former students now in their 40s and 50s, coming up afterward to tell me how she'd changed their lives. What I remember most clearly is walking out of that church 3 hours later, still holding a folded program with my mother's photo on it, and seeing an empty space where my car should have been. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process it. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the church, looking at the empty spot, thinking I'd somehow forgotten where I parked. Then I saw the small paper notice zip tied to a nearby signpost, the kind towing companies leave behind. My car had been towed. Not from the church. From my mother's driveway, apparently photographed and flagged during that 20-minute window when the delivery truck forced me onto the street, and then reported and towed while I was standing at my mother's graveside, 3 miles away, unable to do anything about it because I didn't even know it was happening. The confrontation. My brother drove me to the impound lot because I was in no condition to drive anything, let alone navigate the industrial side of town in a black dress and heels that were never meant for gravel parking lots. The impound facility was exactly what you'd picture: chain link fences, fluorescent lighting, a board clerk behind bulletproof glass who informed me the release fee was $340, cash or card, plus a daily storage fee if I didn't retrieve it before end of business. I paid it. I didn't have the emotional capacity to argue with a clerk who had nothing to do with the decision. I saved my anger for the people who did. That Monday, still numb, still wearing the same exhaustion that funerals leave behind like a residue, I called the HOA management office and asked to speak with Denise directly. When she got on the line, I explained what had happened. I told her my mother had died. I told her I had been at the funeral when the car was towed. I asked how this had happened, given that I'd submitted a hardship request weeks earlier. Her response was almost worse than if she'd been outright cruel. She was polite. She was calm. She told me that the hardship request had been tabled by the board pending further review, that the second violation had triggered an automatic tow order per the community bylaws, and that she was very sorry for my loss in a tone that suggested she said that phrase roughly as often as she said, "Have a nice day." I asked her a simple question. Did anyone check the address, the timing, or the circumstances before authorizing that tow? She said the system flags repeat violations automatically after the second notice, and that the tow company handles execution independently once a flag is triggered. In other words, no human being had looked at my situation and made a decision. A process had run, and nobody had bothered to interrupt it, even though my written request describing exactly this situation had been sitting in someone's inbox for over a month. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. Then I sat at my mother's kitchen table, surrounded by unopened sympathy cards, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this disappear into the pile of small injustices that people simply absorb because fighting back feels exhausting. I was going to find out exactly how this happened, and I was going to make sure it couldn't happen to anyone else. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I made a list. Not a to-do list for funeral logistics or estate paperwork, but a list of questions. Who approved the tow? Whether my hardship letter had ever actually reached a human being. Whether other residents had faced anything similar. Whether the association's own rules had procedures in place for exactly this kind of situation. Procedures that had simply been ignored. Writing those questions down didn't fix anything that night, but it gave my grief somewhere to go besides in circles, and looking back, I think that mattered more than I realized at the time. Caregivers and mourners are often told to rest, to let themselves feel their feelings, to not take on anything extra. That advice is well-meaning, but for me, doing something productive with my anger was the only thing that kept it from turning into something darker. Building the case. Grief has a way of either paralyzing you or focusing you into something sharp. For the next 2 weeks, it focused me. I requested, in writing, a complete copy of Willow Creek's governing documents, meeting minutes, and towing authorization records, citing my mother's status as a homeowner and my legal standing as executor of her estate, a role I'd been appointed to just days after her death. What I found in those documents surprised me. The HOA's own bylaws included a provision allowing the board to grant temporary accommodations for documented medical hardship, requiring only a majority vote at a regular or special meeting. My request had never been placed on any meeting agenda. It had simply been received, logged, and left to expire through inaction, which the bylaws didn't actually recognize as a valid method of denial. In plain terms, they hadn't followed their own rules. They'd just ignored mine. I also discovered, buried in an addendum, a rule requiring the HOA to provide 48 hours written notice before towing any vehicle for a repeat violation, unless the vehicle posed a safety hazard, which mine, parked briefly in a driveway, clearly did not. No such notice had ever been sent. The system Denise described, the one that automatically flagged repeat violations, was operating in direct violation of the association's own governing documents. I reached out to a lawyer a former colleague recommended, someone who specialized in HOA disputes, and paid for a single consultation. She confirmed what I suspected. I had a strong case for reimbursement of towing and storage fees, and potentially grounds for a broader complaint about the board's failure to follow its own bylaws regarding notice and hardship review. But she said something else that stuck with me more than the legal advice. She said, documents like this only change when homeowners make noise. A demand letter gets you your money back. A public homeowners meeting gets you actual change. So I decided to do both. Writing the demand letter took an entire weekend, longer than it should have, because every time I sat down to type, I found myself rereading the section of the bylaws about hardship accommodations and feeling the anger rise up fresh, as if I were hearing Denise's calm, practiced apology all over again. My lawyer reviewed the final draft, tightened a few sentences, and reminded me to keep the tone factual rather than emotional, since demand letters carry more weight when they read like documentation instead of a diary entry. It was hard advice to follow. Every fact in that letter was also, to me, a wound. But I trusted her experience, and in the end, the letter read the way a legal document should: dates, citations to specific bylaw sections, a clear timeline from my original hardship request to the day of the funeral, and a specific dollar figure I expected reimbursed within 14 business days. Finding my neighbors. While preparing my formal demand letter, I started talking to neighbors, something I'd never really done during my mother's illness because there hadn't been time. I knocked on doors up and down the street my mother had lived on for 22 years, introducing myself, explaining what happened, and asking a simple question: had they ever had trouble with the HOA board or with Denise's office? The response stunned me. Nearly every household had a story. The Hendersons, the ones with the garden gnome fine my mother used to joke about, had also been fined for an authorized mailbox flag during a family member's military deployment. A young couple 2 doors down had been threatened with a lien for painting their front door a shade of blue the board deemed not on the approved palette, despite it matching a swatch technically listed in the community guidelines. An elderly widower named Frank, who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, told me he'd stopped attending HOA meetings years ago because arguing with them is like arguing with a brick wall that also sends you a bill. What became clear, conversation by conversation, was that my situation wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was a symptom of a governance structure that had drifted, over years, into rigid rule enforcement without any mechanism for human judgment, run by a small group of people who had grown comfortable wielding minor power without much oversight. I asked if anyone would be willing to attend the next open board meeting with me. 6 households said yes immediately. By the time the meeting rolled around 2 weeks later, that number had grown to 14. The meeting. Willow Creek's HOA held its meetings in the clubhouse attached to the community pool, a room that could seat maybe 40 people comfortably. On the night of the meeting, every seat was filled, and several neighbors stood along the back wall. The board members, 5 of them seated at a folding table at the front, looked visibly unsettled by the turnout, which was apparently 3 or 4 times the normal attendance. I had prepared a 3-minute statement, as the meeting rules allowed for public comment in that time increment. I stood up when my name was called and told them, plainly, what had happened. I described my mother's illness. I described the hardship request that vanished into silence. I described standing at my mother's funeral while her car was being towed 3 miles away. I read directly from their own bylaws, the section on medical hardship accommodations and the 48-hour notice requirement, and I asked, in front of the entire room, why neither had been followed. The board president, a man named Gerald who had held that position for 9 years, tried to respond with the same script Denise had used on the phone: automated systems, standard procedure, sympathy for my loss. But this time, he wasn't talking to one grieving woman on the phone. He was talking to a room full of his own neighbors, several of whom stood up afterward to share their own stories of fines, threats, and unanswered requests. Frank, the elderly widower, stood up without being called on and said something I'll never forget. He said, "I've lived here longer than any of you have been on this board. I remember when this community was built on the idea of looking out for each other. I don't recognize what it's become." The room was silent after that in a way that felt heavier than applause would have. By the end of the meeting, under pressure from an unusually large and unusually organized group of residents, the board agreed to 2 things. First, they would reimburse my towing and storage fees in full, plus a formal written apology, which I'll admit meant less to me than the second thing. Second, they agreed to schedule a special session to review and revise the hardship accommodation and towing notice procedures, with resident input included in that revision, something that had never happened in the community's history. What changed? Over the following 2 months, I stayed involved, partly out of principle and partly, I think, because it gave me something to focus my grief on besides an empty house full of my mother's things. Along with Frank, the young couple with a mailbox letter, and several others, I helped draft language for a revised policy that required any towing decision involving a documented hardship request to go before an actual human board member, not an automated system, within a mandatory response window of 5 business days. We also pushed through, and won, a term limit policy for board positions, something Gerald had quietly resisted for years, which passed by a wide margin at the next annual meeting. Denise, for what it's worth, reached out to me personally after that first meeting, off the record, and admitted that she'd flagged concerns about the automated tow system to the board more than once herself, only to be told it wasn't a priority to fix. I don't think she was a villain in this story so much as someone operating inside a system that rewarded rule following over judgment. That distinction mattered to me, eventually. It didn't excuse what happened, but it helped me understand it. Gerald did not run for board president again the following year. Frank did, at 81 years old, and won by a landslide. The last I heard, the community newsletter he now sends out includes a small section called Neighbor Check-In, where residents can flag if someone might need a temporary accommodation for illness, deployment, or hardship, reviewed personally by a board member rather than an algorithm. It's a small thing. It's also everything my mother's situation needed and never got. What I kept. I still have that yellow violation notice, the very first one, folded up in a drawer in what used to be my mother's kitchen. I kept it not out of anger, though there was plenty of that for a long time, but as a reminder of something I learned during the worst week of my life. Institutions built by people can be changed by people, but only if someone is willing to stand up when it would be so much easier to simply pay the fee. I think about my mother often when I think about this whole ordeal, about how she spent 31 years teaching children that fairness is something you build, not something you wait for. I like to think she would have been out there with me at that meeting, folder of bylaws in hand, asking Gerald exactly why the rules only seemed to bend for the people writing them. She wasn't there. But in a strange way, because of everything that happened, a small piece of what she stood for ended up written into the rules of the community she called home for over 2 decades. That's not nothing. Some days, when I let myself feel it fully, it feels like almost everything. If you take one thing away from this story, let it be this. Grief does not excuse cruelty, and rules without compassion are not actually rules worth defending. They're just excuses dressed up as order. When you find yourself facing an institution that has forgotten there are human beings on the other side of its paperwork, you have more power to change that than you think. Sometimes it takes one letter. Sometimes it takes one meeting. Sometimes it takes standing at a podium 3 weeks after burying your mother and simply refusing to be quiet. That's what I did. And I'd do it again. Looking back now, months removed from that folding chair meeting room and the smell of chlorine drifting in from the pool outside, I don't think of this as a story about a homeowners association at all, not really. I think of it as a story about the moment grief either breaks you or clarifies you, and about the neighbors who stood up beside me when they didn't have to, because somewhere along the way, my fight had quietly become theirs too. If there's a version of this happening to you right now, whatever the institution, whatever the paperwork, whatever the person on the other end of the phone telling you calmly that the rules apply to everyone, I hope you remember that rules written by people can be rewritten by people, and that you are allowed to be both grieving and unwilling to be quiet at the exact same time.